It was August 1944. The circus was coming to Akron, as it had for years. The Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey show was going to be in town for 3 days of highly anticipated performances. Clowns, high flyers, elephants, lions, tigers, oh my. But this year would be different. Ringling's Akron show would be the first since the deadliest fire in circus history. Just a month earlier, on July 6th in Hartford, Connecticut, more than 160 people died in a horrible fire that engulfed the Big Top during an afternoon performance. Ringling Brothers was heading to Akron with major legal problems, serious financial issues, and no Big Top. How could it ever pay off the millions of dollars in lawsuits that were being filed daily? Could it be forced out of business completely? An Akron newspaper editor had dubbed the restarted tour the Blue Heavens Circuit. He had no idea how far from the truth that nickname would be. This is the story of Ringling, Akron, and the Blue Heavens Circuit. Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey was the circus. Pretty much always had been. It was called the Big One, Big Bertha, and the greatest show on earth. It hired only the top performers. It avoided grifters, con men, and fixed midway games. Performers on other shows might make fun of Ringling's squeaky clean Sunday school image, but they would have accepted a job with Big Bertha in a heartbeat. The combined show dated to 1919. By 1944, Ringling had become the biggest and most popular circus in the country. During the Second World War, Ringling and other circuses were struggling, as was everyone. It was hard to get gasoline, steel, rubber, rope, just about every item a circus needed to operate. Ringling Brothers still traveled by train during the war, but only with strict government regulation and supervision. Military trains always took precedence on the nation's railways. The Ringling show often was forced to arrive late or even miss a few shows. And it was getting more difficult to find able-bodied men to do the multiple hard chores required in running a large circus. The big show had had other problems in the 40s as well. In August 1942, during a stay in Cleveland, a devastating fire had destroyed the tent housing the menagerie animals. 45 animals died in the fire or had to be destroyed to end their suffering. Many others were injured. Ringling's 1944 season had opened as it always did, in April, at New York's Madison Square Garden. After a number of successful weeks, it moved to Boston for 12 days. Then, on June 6th, as Allied troops were battling on the beaches of Normandy, Ringling opened its outdoor season under the Big Top in Philadelphia. After that, it spent 2 weeks zigzagging around New England. On July 5th and 6th, it was scheduled for 4 shows in Hartford, Connecticut. But military railroad traffic took precedence. The circus got to Hartford too late for the matinee on the 5th. Circus people hated missing a performance. It was considered bad luck. No one at that moment could have guessed just how bad it would be. Hartford was ready for the circus and the escape from reality it promised. The city of 170,000 people, like towns throughout the country, was weary of the war, the casualty lists, the rationing, the absence of most of its young men. The fighting in Europe and in the South Pacific seemed unrelenting, never-ending. Diversions were needed and welcome. Local movie houses were showing Arsenic and Old Lace with Cary Grant, Covergirl with Rita Hayworth, and Gaslight with Ingrid Bergman. But they could never take the place of the circus for the pure fantasy and the escape it brought. Colorful posters were plastered on building walls and hung in store windows. Newspaper stories pumped the arrival of clown Emmett Kelly and the Flying Walendas. Tickets were expensive in a time of sacrifice and rationing, but for 2 hours of escape from work and war, it was worth it. Or so everyone thought. The Ringling Big Top held just under 10,000 people. The evening performance on Wednesday, July 5th, was close to a full house. Newspapers reported an exciting and colorful show. The matinee on Thursday the 6th was attended primarily by women, children, and grandparents. Most of Hartford's young men were either serving in the military or working in one of the war factories. Estimates of attendance vary at that afternoon show, but most agree it was somewhere around 7,000 customers. The show was supposed to start at 2:15 p.m., but it was running a little late. At 2:23, everyone rose to sing the national anthem. The first act, in the center ring, was a short warm-up skit, a wild animal parody. Then came the big guns. First up, wild animal trainers in 2 rings. Lions, tigers, and bears stared and growled at each other as the trainers put them through their paces. Next, the incredible Flying Walendas. High overhead, spotlight shining, they were just starting their thrilling high-wire act when someone shouted, "Fire!" A small sliver of flame was spotted on a canvas sidewall of the Big Top. It shimmied up the sidewall quickly. Within a minute, it grew and leaped to the big top roof, the massive 19-ton canvas that covered the entire 3 rings of the circus. The big top roof was waterproof, not fireproof. Some 1,800 pounds of paraffin wax had been mixed with 6,000 gallons of gasoline and brushed onto the canvas. In a fire, that combination was deadly. In less than 10 minutes after the fire reached the massive canvas roof, the big top was destroyed, consumed by a voracious inferno. Thankfully, thousands were able to leave through the main entrance and some side exits. Hundreds escaped through or under sidewalls. But hundreds of others struggled to get out. Panic quickly set in. Scores could not escape. It was chaos. It was a stampede. It was a disaster. Newspapers flashed the story around the country. Headlines told of mounting death tolls. Experts still disagree on the final total, but at least 167 people died in or as a result of the fire. Of that number, 67 were children. About 70% of the dead and injured were women. Almost 500 people reported injuries. Scores of others treated cuts, burns, or broken bones on their own. Ringling's big top, bleachers, and most of its equipment destroyed. It had started out as a day for mothers and children, grandmothers and grandfathers, to enjoy a day of escape at the circus. It had ended up as a day from hell, the deadliest fire in circus history. The fire quickly burned itself out. Then events happened quickly. By 3 p.m., the first victims were reaching area hospitals. By 4 p.m., bodies were arriving at a temporary morgue. By 5 p.m., an investigation into the fire already was underway. Circus officials and workers were questioned for 12 hours. By early the next morning, state and local authorities had heard enough. 5 circus employees were arrested and charged with manslaughter. That same morning, July 7th, only 18 hours after the fire, the first of hundreds of lawsuits was filed against the circus. The local sheriff promptly served writs on circus staff at the showground and at the railroad yards where the Ringling train sat. No circus property could be moved. No circus officers, crew, or performers could leave the area. Hundreds of circus animals had to be given temporary homes in nearby fields and backyards. Over the next few days, more investigations got underway, and more suits were filed. Speculation was rampant that the Ringling Brothers Circus was in serious financial and legal trouble. Many thought it might be months before it could be back on the road. Some thought, in fact, it might be finished.
The consensus among outdoor show people is that the circus will not get back on the road this season. The litigation tying up circus property in Hartford and the suits for damages are viewed as making it impossible to get the show working again this year. United Press Wire Service.
With the mammoth main tent and all its voluminous equipment reduced to ashes, many people, some of them circus folks, were certain that the greatest show on earth was finished for the season, if not for all time. Roland Butler, Ringling publicity man.
Indeed, the circus was in a severe financial bind. But so too were the victims and their families. Ringling had postponed or canceled future performances for the year. There was no money coming in. The entire show was stranded in Hartford. Ringling's assets and insurance would not cover all the lawsuits. If the circus was forced to file for bankruptcy, only a handful of the hundreds of victims would receive any money. It appeared to be a no-win situation for everyone. Then, several Hartford attorneys stepped in. They had devised a complex receivership plan that would keep the circus in business and ensure that all victims would receive financial awards. The circus would agree to pay off all claims. Eventually, they would total about $4 million, some $64 million today. The show would be allowed to leave Connecticut and get back to performing as soon as possible. Profits from future shows would go into a fund for the Hartford victims. Victims and their families would agree to drop their lawsuits. All victims would receive settlements through a court-supervised arbitration plan. Early on July 15th, 9 days after the devastating fire, Ringling's trains pulled out of Hartford, headed for winter quarters in Sarasota, Florida. Crews there already had started the awesome rebuilding task. Equipment, props, apparatus. Almost everything had to be repaired or recreated. Some animals had been inactive so long, they needed crash retraining programs. Top circus officials, meanwhile, were wrestling with basic issues. How soon can we get back on the road? How do we perform without a big top? When and where do we start the comeback tour? The first decision had largely been made by the legal agreement. The Ringling show would go back on the road as soon as possible. It was just a matter of how quickly equipment could be replaced and how rapidly new venues could be found and rented. It might take weeks, it might take months. That led to the second decision. Without a big top, the circus was left with two choices as to where to perform. It could seek out large indoor arenas or armories. Those, however, might be available only in larger cities and might already be booked. Or it could consider outdoor stadiums, baseball parks, and fairgrounds. Those tended to be more plentiful around the country. Either way, it would be a dramatic change from the big top. Ringling chose the outdoor option. The next question, where to restart the 1944 tour, was more difficult. It also was highly important for both financial and public relations reasons. Ringling Brothers knew the world would be watching. They needed lots of paying customers and seats. They needed plenty of good publicity. They needed a circus-friendly town. There was a performance schedule already in place from before the fire. All those shows had been canceled because of the fire. Springfield, Massachusetts, Syracuse and Buffalo, New York, Detroit, Chicago, Akron. All were logical candidates to be selected for the vital restart of the tour. Where would the Ringling Circus go first? The answer came quickly, and somewhat surprisingly. It would start in the rubber capital of the world. Murray Powers was a newspaper man and ardent circus fan. In 1944, he was the Sunday editor of the Akron Beacon Journal. But he wrote about circuses every chance he got. He also visited circuses as often as he could. He was a member of the Circus Fans of America. He had even written a first-person feature story about his experience of dressing up as a Ringling clown and appearing in a skit. When Ringling Brothers announced it would perform only under open skies, competitors had derided it as the topless show. Powers gave it a much kinder nickname, the Blue Heaven Circuit. And it stuck. Other newspapers and wire services picked it up. So did Billboard magazine, the Bible of show business back then. The idea, of course, was that without a big top, the circus would be performing under the sun or stars. So why did the circus choose Akron sun and stars? There were several possible reasons. Akron was definitely a circus-friendly town. It had been a regular stop on Ringling's tours as far back as 1900. Attendance was always good. Akron's business leaders and prominent families had hosted circus officials and performers at posh outings whenever they were in the area. The influential Circus Fans of America had active chapters in Northeast Ohio. The national president was from Akron. But probably most important of all, Akron had a large and available municipal stadium, the Rubber Bowl. Two other Ohio cities considered for the restart, Cincinnati and Columbus, couldn't promise such a venue, or at least one that was available. It apparently was enough to persuade Ringling officials. On July 19th, one day after the big show got back to Sarasota, Akron already was in Ringling's sights. A circus official contacted Akron's service director and asked about the municipal stadium. Was it available? How much would it cost for a 3-day stand? The Ringling official was assured that they could work out a satisfactory arrangement. Charlie Burns was the very proactive manager of the Rubber Bowl. Shortly after the Hartford fire, he had written to Robert Ringling, president of the circus, expressing his condolences and suggesting that, if the circus ever got started again, Akron Stadium might be a good place to launch the new tour. A few days later, Ringling called Burns. The circus was indeed going back on the road in 1944, and it would like to start at the Rubber Bowl. As for when, how about soon? Circus crews in Florida had done an outstanding job of repairing, rebuilding, or replacing equipment. Ringling and Burns agreed on August 4th, 5th, and 6th. Remarkably, that was barely a month after the fire. Rent would be $1,500 a day. A few days later, Ringling Brothers formally announced it would start its comeback tour in Akron, followed by visits to Detroit, Chicago, and other cities in the Midwest and South. But its new tentless format would be tried out first in Akron. Rubber Bowl was the semi-official title given to Akron's municipal stadium. The name paid tribute to the massive economic presence of the rubber industry in the city. Goodyear, Goodrich, and other rubber companies called Akron home in the 40s. They annually produced tens of thousands of tires and other consumer products and employed thousands of local men and women. During the war, those companies also were churning out products for use by the military. The Rubber Bowl had opened in 1940, built into the side of a hill overlooking a busy municipal airport. There was lots of air traffic, private single-engine planes, commercial airlines, and cargo flights. The airport also was the site of the massive Goodyear Air Dock, where dirigibles were produced and housed. It also had a large Goodyear plant that produced inflatable rafts and Corsair airplanes during the war. The city of 250,000 people was bustling. The municipal stadium was literally right next door to Derby Downs, home of the annual All-American Soapbox Derby. The multi-purpose Rubber Bowl seated more than 35,000 people. In the 1940s, it hosted high school and college football games, the Harry James Orchestra, mini auto races, religious services, and horse shows. There was an ice volley show, even a performance of Verdi's opera, Aida. Now, it would host one of the most important events in the history of the Ringling Brothers Circus, the beginning of the newly reconfigured Blue Heaven Circus. On Wednesday, August 2nd, Ringling trains hauled into South Akron on the Pennsylvania tracks near the Firestone plant. As if a harbinger of things to come, circus officials discovered that the flat cars carrying the circus wagons were pointed in the wrong direction for unloading. The train had to travel another 15 miles north to the Hudson Yard to get the trains turned around before heading back to Akron. The Rubber Bowl was located about 5 miles east of the rail siding at South Main Street and Wilbeth Road. The circus had to travel east by truck along busy Waterloo Road, Route 224, to get to the Rubber Bowl Derby Downs complex. The stadium was not exactly centrally located. The open-air Rubber Bowl site presented a new and strange configuration for the circus. On Wednesday afternoon, 3 rings and 2 stages were installed inside the stadium. Poles for high wire acts stretched high into the air. The audience would sit on only one side of the rubber bowl. The circus would not be theater in the round. Almost all seating was uncomfortable permanent wood benches with no backs. Limited premium seating with metal folding chairs was available down front. Everything not related to performing was set up outside the stadium in as organized a fashion as circumstances would allow. The ticket booth would be a busy place, with parents and grandparents buying tickets for youngsters. Off to the left were sideshows and barkers, with sword swallowers, snake charmers, and assorted human oddities. You could buy hot dogs, candy, or a soft drink nearby. Other concession stands offered pennants, balloons, and assorted souvenirs of the big show. Just as you went into the stadium, you could visit a small, open-air menagerie with giraffes, camels, and other interesting animals. Akron had been experiencing a hot spell. The weather for the Wednesday setup was warm and muggy, 88 degrees. Hundreds of perspiring Akron residents pushed against a fence to watch the operation. Landing and departing aircraft at the airport next door droned almost directly overhead. It took until midnight for the weary crew to get everything in place. The next day, Thursday, the 3rd, was too warm again. The thermometer hit 95. Robert Ringling put performers through 2 full-length rehearsals, one during the day and one under the stars. It was informal. Some performers wore costumes, most opted not to. Women were in shorts and bathing suits, men in slacks and t-shirts. Some clowns wore makeup, others didn't. The second rehearsal did not end until midnight again. It had been another long, hot, stressful day. Without a big top, the noise from the airplanes was loud, distracting, and continuous. Without a big top, the band's music tended to evaporate into the atmosphere. And without a big top, there certainly wasn't much close contact between performers and the audience. Circus folks were finding out that performing outdoors was quite different from performing under a big, closely confined canvas roof. Still, Emmett Kelly, one of America's favorite clowns, was optimistic.
We must entertain. In wartime, it's more important than ever. It's going to be great in the open air.
Emmett Kelly was a fabulous clown. He was a poor prognosticator. It was not great in the open air. The oppressive heat continued. On opening day, Friday, August 4th, the thermometer hit 95 again. It was humid. Rain was in the forecast. The sun beat down on the stadium floor and the open-air seats. In a 35,000-seat stadium, the first matinee drew barely 2,000 souls. Some folks said the number was even lower. The show, according to reports, though, was wonderful. Clowns cavorted, horses pranced, aerialists performed at heights not possible before. There was no big top roof to confine them. Evening attendance on Friday was better. More than 4,000 people bought tickets and enjoyed the Walendas at night. But the rain that had threatened the matinee finally showed up. Downpours stopped the performance twice. Performers ran inside the rubber bowl. Customers huddled under cardboard or soggy programs. The weather pattern for the Akron performance was set. Saturday matinee customers, again, were drenched by downpours. The stadium had good drainage, but the field and track still grew soggy. Puddles of water splattered performers' shoes and costumes. The temperature shot into the 90s once more. Saturday night's performance had more customers and another threat of rain. Robert Ringling told reporters, only half-jokingly, that he would follow baseball rules. If the circus hadn't completed half its 22 acts before the rains came, he would issue rain checks. By Sunday, the final day of the Akron stop, the temperature had dropped to 86, and the rain was largely gone. Some 10,000 Akronites turned out for the last two shows. Still, overall turnout was disappointing, even though newspapers reported that the circus's performances in the open air were polished, colorful, and exciting. Indeed, there were some folks who thought the outdoor performances were just as good as those under the big top.
The performances were amazingly effective in the new setup. The night lighting effects were even more striking, and much of the performance was even more appealing than under the conventional big top. Tom Gregory, president of the Circus Fans of America.
Initially, total attendance for all 6 Akron shows was announced at a paltry 30,000. The crowds from those 6 shows, even placed together in the rubber bowl all at one time, would not have filled the place. Shortly after the circus left town, officials did revise the attendance figures downward. Only 21,000 people attended the 6 shows, officials said. Some thought even that figure might be inflated.
The big show staged a magnificent comeback. It gave colorful proof that it was still very much in business. The rehabilitated circus gave spectacularly beautiful and highly sensational outdoor performances in Akron's sky-canopied rubber bowl. Roland Butler, Ringling publicity man.
Butler had at least one thing right. The performances were entertaining and thrilling. When it wasn't raining or threatening to rain, or when the scorching sun wasn't beating down. Audiences were enthusiastic, but embarrassingly small. 2,000 or 3,000 customers would be a poor turnout in a 9,000-seat big top. In a large outdoor stadium, it was woeful. One news report even suggested the 3-day engagement lost $25,000. There were just so many things working against the circus in Akron. Things that would be repeated in many of the cities on the comeback tour. First was the weather. Even for August, it was hot and steamy. It had been a backyard pool kind of summer. Temperatures were in the 90s almost the entire time the circus was in Akron and the upper Midwest. For matinees, the sun beat down without mercy. There was no shade at the Rubber Bowl. And when the sun wasn't wilting everyone, rain was soaking them. Day or night didn't matter. Tom Gregory, the Akron man who headed up the Circus Fans of America, pretty much summed it up.
Amid intense heat and humidity, the big show started the comeback trail. And then it rained.
Second, while the open-air stadium seemed to be an ideal environment for a circus performance, it wasn't. Planes taking off and landing at the airport next door were distracting at a minimum. The roars of their engines fought voice and music. They set animals to howling and roaring. Third, the Rubber Bowl was not centrally located. It was 7 miles from downtown Akron. Public buses ran near the stadium, but factory workers at the Goodyear air dock already packed them, going to and from their jobs. Mix in the gas rationing in place during the war, and transportation to the Rubber Bowl was not one of the strong points during the appearance. Finally, Akron and much of the Midwest were in the middle of a polio outbreak. Health departments were advising parents to keep their children away from crowds, and that included circuses. Unhappily, the rest of the restarted Blue Heaven tour was not much better. After the Ringling trains pulled out of Akron, the big show set up for 13 days at the University of Detroit's football stadium. Weather that was too hot and too wet repeated itself in the Motor City. The circus had one sellout performance at the 25,000-seat stadium, but only 3,500 people showed up the next night. From Detroit, the show headed to Chicago for a long run at the huge Soldier Field. One evening, with threatening weather, only 1,400 customers showed up. Raincoats and skimpy crowds, again, were too common. As in Akron and Detroit, some crowds were bigger than others, depending on the weather. Still, after a month on the restarted tour, Ringling officials were having second thoughts. Dan Judge, one of Ringling's lawyers, was blunt in his assessment.
We started out under adverse circumstances. We had terrifically high temperatures. When we came to Chicago, we felt it was hopeless. We were losing money. People weren't coming to the show. We felt we should just fold it up and send it back to Sarasota.
But they resisted that temptation. They were determined to stay on the road until November to make as much money as they could to pay off claims. The circus slogged on through open-air stadiums and ballparks in Indiana, Wisconsin, Iowa, Missouri, Texas, and Louisiana. Some stops were better than others. Weather improved, crowds got larger. But overall, it was a disappointing tour. Finally, with 3 weeks still on the schedule, circus officials called it quits. In early October, Ringling wrapped up the Blue Heaven tour in a rainy and muddy Pelican Stadium in New Orleans. The show had been on the comeback road for 9 weeks. After expenses, the circus has actually turned a profit, but only $100,000. which was promptly earmarked for the Victims Fund in Hartford. Murray Powers summed it up.
The tentless stadium route was a brave and grand idea. The show had to get back on the road. It had to keep its personnel, keep its name, and try to make as much money as possible to meet the huge losses. Unfortunately, the Blue Heaven Circuit Tour was not successful.
By the middle of October 1944, the Ringling Brothers Circus was back in winter quarters in Sarasota. After the dreary season, everyone's eyes already were squarely on spring, still 6 months away, and the 1945 tour. The 44 season had been exhausting and stressful. Performers and circus brass hoped that by the time the 45 season rolled around, things would be better. And they were. The circus started out, as usual, indoors at Madison Square Garden with packed houses. Then it was crunch time, time for the show to go back on the road under canvas, the new fire-resistant canvas. In early June, the circus set up the Big Top in Washington, D.C. for the first time since the Hartford fire. There was considerable concern about how customers would feel being inside a large, closed tent again. Ringling took nothing for granted. The circus invited General George C. Marshall, Victoria's Chief of Staff in the European Theater, to be its guest of honor. As World War II was winding down, Marshall was highly respected and popular. He was a future U.S. Secretary of State and Nobel Prize winner. Marshall showed up at the Big Top in full dress uniform with his 3-year-old grandson. If General Marshall was not afraid to bring his grandson to the show, it must be safe. At least, that was the message Ringling's front office was trying to send. And it worked. The circus had a highly successful 1945 season. Another large payment went to Hartford victims. It took the circus 6 years, but all 670 claims that eventually were filed were paid off. Those claims totaled just under $4 million, about $64 million today. 1945 was an important year across the board. In Hartford, victims were remembered on the first anniversary of the fire. 5 Ringling officials got ready to spend time in prison. They had been convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 1 to 3 years. Most of the sentences were reduced on appeal. In cities across the country, stringent new laws were in place requiring circuses to use fire-retardant canvas and to provide escape routes. Ringling even installed movable metal staircases leading down from the top of the grandstands and out the back of the tent. Injured victims of the fire were still recovering. In April 1945, the last hospitalized child went home for good. Investigations into the fire wrapped up. They all found the circus at fault. None blamed the city of Hartford or its officials. None could pinpoint the cause of the fire. The circus did not appear in Hartford in 1945, and it would not for the next 30 years. The Hartford fire was the opening act in the demise of the large Big Top circus. The dramatic development of television in the early 1950s helped assure its passing. Ringling moved on from the fire, but attendance was down markedly over the next few years. Finally, on July 16, 1956, after another sparsely attended show, this one near Pittsburgh, Ringling officials had had enough. Tired of losing money, they shut down the Big Top and went back to winter quarters. John Ringling North proclaimed, "The tented circus is a thing of the past." Ringling's closing came, interestingly, just 3 days after its last appearance under canvas in Akron. Ringling had spent 1 day there on July 13th. This time the circus set up not in, but near the Rubber Bowl, in a field on the grounds of the airport. That same airport that 12 years earlier had been one of the thorns in the side of the greatest show on earth. In 1956, though, the show was standing room only, literally. Some 10,000 customers packed the Big Top. Customers spilled out of the stands. Some acts didn't have room to perform. Elephants couldn't get into the tent. There was a certain symmetry to the Akron show, being one of Ringling's final performances under canvas. It was, after all, where the circus had relaunched its 1944 tour after the Hartford fire. It had been the start of the highly anticipated, albeit disappointing, Blue Heaven Circuit.